The moment my fingers touched that garage doorknob, I froze because the voice I heard on the other side wasn't planning a surprise party. Angelus, it was planning my downfall. And it belonged to the one person I trusted most in this world. If you're watching this from your kitchen table tonight, drop your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story has traveled. Angelus, and if stories about family, Angelus, betrayal, Angelus, and finding your strength again speak to you, hit subscribe, Angelus, because I have so much more to share with you. Now let me take you back to the day it all began. Angelus, my name is Evelyn Parker. I'm 61 years old, and until one Tuesday afternoon in October, I would have told you I understood my family better than anyone else on this earth. Angelus, I raised my son Michael alone after his father passed. Angelus, I watched him grow from a shy Angelus, gap-toothed boy who cried when he lost at checkers into a confident man with his own company. Angelus, a lovely wife named Claire. Angelus, and a 7-year-old daughter who called me Grandma Evie and left glitter on every surface of my house. Angelus, I was proud. Angelus, I was, if I'm honest, a little smug about it. Not every mother gets to watch her child build a life that whole. So when I found his spare house keys sitting on my kitchen counter, forgotten in the rush before his business trip, I didn't think twice. Picked them up, dropped them in my purse, and told myself I'd swing by his place after my errands. Angelus, he'd need them when he got back. Angelus, that was all. Angelus, a small errand. Angelus, a mother doing what mothers do. Angelus, I didn't call ahead. Angelus, I never did. 30 years of visiting my son's house, I'd never once needed an invitation. Angelus, I should have called, because when I turned onto his street, his car was in the driveway. Angelus, that stopped me cold. Michael was supposed to be 3 states away, in a conference room somewhere in Ohio, closing a deal he'd been talking about for weeks. Angelus, I sat there in my car for a second. Angelus, keys in my lap. Angelus, wondering if I'd misheard him. Angelus, if the trip had been postponed. Angelus, if something was wrong. Angelus, I got out. I walked up the path with his spare keys still warm in my hand, already composing the joke I'd make. Did you forget you had a business trip, or just forget to tell your mother? Angelus, and that's when I heard the voices. They were coming from the garage. The side window was cracked open, the way it always was when Michael puttered around out there. Angelus, I recognized his voice first, Angelus, and then hers, Claire's voice, calm. Kind of calm you use when you've rehearsed something. Angelus, I told you. Angelus, she was saying. Angelus, once Evelyn signs the final documents, Angelus, everything will be much easier. Angelus, I stopped walking. I stood there on the path, one foot on the flagstone, feeling the blood drain out of my face like someone had pulled a plug. Angelus, Evelyn, that was me. Angelus, there is only one Evelyn in this family. Angelus, Michael's voice again, quieter. Angelus, but she trusts us. And then I will hear this sound for the rest of my life. Claire laughed. Angelus, not a cruel laugh. Angelus, a soft, satisfied one. The laugh of someone who already knows how a story ends. Angelus, that's exactly why this will work. Angelus, I didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there. It might have been 10 seconds. It might have been a full minute, holding a set of house keys that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever carried in my life. Heavier than the casket at my husband's funeral. Heavier than the day I signed the papers on my first house, alone, with a toddler on my hip and no one to tell me it would be all right. Because in that moment I understood something with a clarity that made my knees go weak. Those keys were not the reason I had come here. They were the reason I had found out. I didn't knock. I didn't announce myself. Didn't clear my throat. Didn't do any of the things a mother is supposed to do when she arrives at her son's home. Turned around, walked back to my car on legs that didn't feel like mine, and drove home with the radio off and my hands shaking on the wheel the entire way. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. Angelus, I am not a suspicious woman. I am not the type who reads hidden meaning into every phone call or keeps a running list of grievances. I gave people the benefit of the doubt so consistently that my late husband used to tease me about it. Evelyn, you'd find a good reason for the devil showing up late. I built my whole life on the belief that love, real love, doesn't need to be double-checked. Angelus, and for the first time in 61 years, Angelus, I sat in my own driveway, Angelus, engine ticking as it cooled, Angelus, and asked myself a question I never thought I would have to ask about my own child. Angelus, can I trust my son? Angelus, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed replaying every syllable, testing them, turning them over like stones to see if there was some innocent underside I'd missed. Angelus, once Evelyn signs the final documents. Final documents for what? I hadn't signed anything final. I hadn't signed anything recently other than, Angelus, I sat straight up in bed. Other than the papers Michael had brought over back in the spring. Angelus, I remembered it clearly now, Angelus, because at the time it had felt almost tender. My son, Angelus, sitting at my kitchen table with a folder of paperwork, Angelus, telling me it was time we got some things in order, Angelus, that a woman my age living alone should have her affairs protected. He'd smiled at me the way he used to smile as a boy when he wanted to be praised for doing something responsible. Angelus, it's nothing scary, Mom, he'd said. Angelus, just some protections. Anything ever happens to you, so nobody has to fight over decisions, so everything's already settled. Angelus, I remembered feeling grateful. Grateful that my son thought of these things. Grateful that I wouldn't have to burden him with confusion later in life. I remembered signing where he'd flagged with little yellow tabs, barely glancing at the pages between them, because why would I need to? This was Michael. Angelus, this was my boy. Lying there in the dark, I felt something curdle in my stomach. Angelus, I got up before sunrise. Angelus, made coffee I didn't drink. Angelus, and sat at that same kitchen table where I'd signed those papers. Angelus, trying to remember every detail. Claire had been there too, hadn't she? Hovering near the coffee maker, refilling my cup before I even asked, telling me how relieved she was that I was finally being smart about this stuff. Angelus, I remembered thinking how sweet it was, how lucky I was to have a daughter-in-law who cared. Now the memory played differently in my mind. Now I noticed the way she hadn't quite looked at me while she said it. Now I noticed that Michael had turned the folder slightly so the yellow tabs faced me first, so I signed before I could read what came before them. Angelus, I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself grief and shock could make a person see conspiracies in coffee cups. But another part of me, a part I had ignored for a very long time, was quietly, insistently saying, you already know something is wrong. Angelus, you knew it in the driveway. Stop making excuses for people who don't deserve them. Over the following days, I found myself doing something I had never done before, watching my own family like a stranger might. I noticed that Michael called more often now than he had in years, always warm, Angelus, always full of just checking in, Mom, Angelus, but always somehow, Angelus, steering the conversation toward my finances. Had I looked at consolidating my accounts? Did I have a system for my bills, now that things could get complicated as a person got older? He said older the way you'd say a diagnosis, gently, like he was breaking news to me about my own body. Angelus, Claire called even more. She asked after my blood pressure, Angelus, my knees, Angelus, whether I'd been to my checkup, Angelus, whether the house felt like too much to manage on my own these days. Almost in passing, whether I'd updated my will since the spring. She asked it while I was in the middle of telling her about my garden, Angelus, and I remember answering without thinking, Angelus, the way you answer any small question from someone you love, Angelus, and only much later understanding that the question hadn't been small at all. Angelus, at the time all of it had felt like love. It had felt like a son and daughter-in-law finally stepping up, finally treating me like someone worth worrying over. Now, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the morning light coming in flat and gray, I wondered whether I had been mistaking a rehearsal for affection. I went into my home office, the small back room that used to be Michael's bedroom, the one I still hadn't fully turned into anything else, because some part of me liked keeping his height marks penciled on the doorframe, and I pulled out the folder from the spring. Angelus, I hadn't looked at it since the day I signed it. Angelus, I'd trusted my son to have looked at it for me. Angelus, I sat down and read every page. Angelus, slowly this time. Angelus, all the way through, not just the tabs. My hands started shaking somewhere around the third page. The language was dense, the kind of language lawyers use precisely because most people won't push through it, but even I could understand enough. There was a durable power of attorney broad, sweeping, granting Michael authority over my finances that went far beyond in case anything happens to me. There was language about property decisions, Angelus, about access to accounts, about authority that, as far as I could tell, didn't require me to be incapacitated at all. Angelus, it simply required my son to decide it was time to use it. I sat there with that folder open in my lap for a long time, feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the floor of my whole life quietly giving way. Angelus, I am not a woman who panics easily. Angelus, I raised a child by myself after burying a husband. I have sat in hospital waiting rooms and unemployment offices and closed on a house with a real estate agent who tried to talk over me because he assumed a widow wouldn't know better. Angelus, I have handled hard things. But I had never before had to consider that the hard thing might be my own son. Angelus, I didn't call Michael. Angelus, I didn't call Claire. Instead, the next morning, I did something that felt almost like a betrayal in itself. I called a lawyer who had never met either of them. Her name was Diane Whitfield, recommended by a friend from my book club whose husband had gone through something similar with a business partner years ago. I remember sitting in my car outside her office, those same keys still in the bottom of my purse, wondering if I was about to blow up my family over a misunderstanding. Diane was maybe 50, sharp-eyed, with the kind of calm that made you feel like nothing you said would shock her. Angelus, I told her everything. Angelus, the keys, the voices through the garage window. Angelus, the folder. My hands were shaking again as I slid the papers across her desk, and I remember actually apologizing for taking up her time over what might be nothing. She read in silence for what felt like a very long time. Then she looked up at me and asked one question that I have not been able to stop thinking about since. Angelus, Mrs. Parker, Angelus, she said gently, Angelus, when was the last time you personally reviewed every document you've signed? I opened my mouth to answer and found that I didn't have one. Angelus, not really. Angelus, I had trusted. I had trusted so completely, so automatically, that I had genuinely never thought to ask myself the question. Angelus, that's all right, Diane said, seeing my face. Angelus, that's what I'm here for now. But I want you to sit with that question, because it matters more than you think. Told me she wanted a few days to look into things properly, the documents, and, Angelus, if I was comfortable with it, Angelus, a look at any financial activity connected to my accounts. Angelus, I told her to do whatever she needed to do. I remember driving home that afternoon feeling like I'd stepped off a ledge and hadn't hit the ground yet. 4 days later, she called and asked me to come back in. Angelus, this time she didn't ease into it. Angelus, there are transfers, Angelus, she said, Angelus, moving out of accounts linked to your name, Angelus, into an entity I don't think you're familiar with. Angelus, she turned her laptop toward me. On the screen was a name I had genuinely never seen before, some small holding company, official sounding, forgettable, the kind of name you'd skim past on a piece of mail. It's registered, Diane said quietly to Claire. Angelus, I sat there staring at the screen, Angelus, and I want to tell you that I felt fury, Angelus, or vindication, Angelus, or even relief that my instincts had been right. What I actually felt was much smaller and much worse. Angelus, I felt like a fool. I thought of Claire bringing me coffee every Sunday, asking about my knees, calling me Mom in that easy, affectionate way she'd had since the wedding. I thought of her hand on my shoulder at my husband's grave, Angelus, all those years ago, Angelus, a young woman who wasn't even family yet, Angelus, crying because she said she hated to see me hurting. Angelus, the woman who called me Mom. The woman who was, Angelus, it now appeared, Angelus, quietly building a plan around the very life I had spent decades protecting, my house, Angelus, my savings, Angelus, the small, Angelus, hard-won security I'd built by myself after losing my husband, Angelus, so that I would never again have to depend on anyone's mercy. Angelus, I sat in that office and I did not cry. Angelus, I want you to know that because it surprised me too. I had cried plenty over smaller things, a burnt dinner, a sad movie, my granddaughter's first day of kindergarten. But sitting there learning that my son and his wife might be maneuvering behind my back for my own money, I felt something colder settle over me instead. Something that, looking back now, I recognize as the very first moment I began to protect myself. Angelus, what do I ask Diane? Angelus, she closed the laptop slowly. For now, she said nothing that tips them off. We gather everything properly, quietly, and completely before we ever sit them down at a table. You don't warn people like this, Mrs. You show them the truth all at once when there's nowhere left for them to go. Angelus, I nodded, though some small Angelus, stubborn Angelus, hopeful part of me was still whispering that there had to be an explanation. Michael Angelus, my Michael Angelus, the boy who used to leave dandelions on my pillow, Angelus, could not possibly be part of something like this. I drove home that evening past his old middle school, past the diner where I used to take him for pancakes after his father's chemo appointments, past every landmark of a life I thought I understood completely. Angelus, and somewhere on that drive, Angelus, I stopped rehearsing excuses for my son and started instead, Angelus, rehearsing the question I would eventually have to ask him to his face. Why did you think I would never find out? I didn't know yet how much worse the answer would be than the question. I didn't know that this was only the beginning of the unraveling, that the documents in that folder were just the surface of something Diane and I were about to spend weeks digging through. Angelus, I only knew, Angelus, driving home in the dark with my hands finally steady on the wheel, Angelus, that the woman who had walked up that garden path a week earlier, trusting, Angelus, unguarded, Angelus, certain of her family's love, was already gone. And the woman who replaced her was not going to be so easy to fool. Diane called me again on a Thursday morning, and the moment I heard her voice I knew something had shifted. Angelus, she wasn't easing into it this time. Angelus, she said, Evelyn, Angelus, I need you to come in today. Angelus, not tomorrow. Today. I remember standing in my kitchen with the phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, my other hand gripping the edge of the counter like the floor might tilt. Is it bad? I asked her. Paused just long enough for me to know the answer before she said it. Angelus, it's more than we thought. I hung up and stood there for a full minute before I even moved. Angelus, my coffee went cold on the counter. I remember looking at my reflection in the microwave door, an old woman in a cardigan, Angelus, gray at the temples, Angelus, eyes that still somehow, Angelus, looked like they belonged to someone who trusted the world. Angelus, I didn't recognize her anymore. Or maybe I recognized her too well, and that was the problem. I drove to Diane's office faster than I should have. My hands were steady on the wheel this time, which surprised me. Somewhere over the last week, the shaking had stopped, Angelus, not because I was less afraid, because fear had turned into something colder and more useful. Diane's office smelled like coffee and old paper, the way it always did, but that morning it felt like a courtroom. Angelus, she had a folder waiting for me on the desk, thicker than the last one, with sticky tabs poking out of the sides in 3 different colors. Angelus, sit down, she said. Angelus, not unkindly. Angelus, just direct. Angelus, I sat. I want to walk you through this slowly, she said, because I don't think you should hear it any other way. Angelus, just tell me, I said. She opened the folder anyway, methodical as ever, and slid the first page toward me. Angelus, this is a corporate filing. Angelus, Meadowline Holdings, L. Registered 8 months ago. She tapped a name near the bottom. Angelus, Claire is listed as managing member. Angelus, I know, I said quietly. Angelus, you told me that already. What I didn't tell you, Diane said, is what Meadowline Holdings has been doing since it was formed. She pulled a second page, a printed spreadsheet, rows and rows of transaction dates. Angelus, 4 transfers. All from an account that was opened in your name back in March. You don't remember opening. Angelus, I stared at the numbers. Stomach dropped somewhere around the 2nd row. Angelus, I didn't open any account in March. Angelus, I didn't think you had, Diane said. But your signature is on the application. Angelus, I felt the room tilt. Angelus, just slightly. Angelus, the way it does right before you faint. Angelus, except I didn't faint. I just sat very still and let the anger come up through me instead, slow and hot, replacing the fear 1 degree at a time. Angelus, how, I said. Does someone open an account in my name without me knowing? Diane's face didn't soften, but her voice did. The same way they get anyone to sign anything they don't fully read. They put it in front of you at the right moment, folded into a stack of other paperwork, and they trust that you love them enough not to interrogate every page. Angelus, I thought of that spring afternoon. Angelus, the kitchen table. Angelus, Michael's easy smile. Angelus, Claire refilling my coffee before I even asked. Angelus, it's nothing scary, Mom. Angelus, just some protections. I thought about how many pages had been in that folder, and how many yellow tabs, and how many pages I had simply never seen because they'd been tucked behind the ones I signed. Angelus, they planned this, I said. Angelus, my voice came out flatter than I expected. Angelus, this wasn't a moment of weakness. It wasn't Claire getting greedy on a whim. Angelus, this was planned. Can't tell you their intentions, Diane said carefully. Can only tell you what the paper trail shows. Angelus, and what it shows is a pattern. Angelus, not one mistake. Angelus, a pattern. I sat back in the chair and pressed my palms flat against my thighs, the way I used to steady myself in the hospital waiting room years ago, back when my husband was sick and I needed my hands to stop shaking before I walked back into his room. Angelus, I didn't want him to see me scared. I didn't want to give this family, my family, the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart either, even in an empty office where no one but Diane could see me. There's something else, Diane said. Angelus, I looked up. Angelus, there's more. Angelus, there is. She hesitated, which was unlike her. In the 2 weeks I'd known her, Diane Whitfield had never once hesitated over a piece of information. One of the transfers into Meadowline came directly after a call made to your bank. Someone called pretending to verify account details. Call came from Michael's cell phone. I don't know how to explain what that did to me. Angelus, the Claire piece I had already begun, God help me, to accept. Angelus, Claire had married into this family. Claire had not grown up eating my pancakes or falling asleep on my shoulder during car rides or calling me at 2 a.m. from college, homesick and half-drunk, needing to hear my voice. Angelus, Claire, I could almost, Angelus, tell myself was capable of something like this. Angelus, because some small, ugly, Angelus, self-protective part of my brain had already been building a wall between my son and the woman who married him. This erased the wall in one sentence. Angelus, Michael's phone. Michael's voice on a call, verifying details on an account he knew wasn't mine to open. Angelus, I put my hand over my mouth. Angelus, I don't remember deciding to do it. It was just there, covering the sound that wanted to come out of me, because I was afraid if I let it out in that office, I might not be able to stop. Angelus, I'm sorry, Diane said quietly. Angelus, I know this is hard to hear. Called my bank, I said through my fingers. My son called my bank and pretended to be verifying my information so that I couldn't finish the sentence. Angelus, I didn't need to. Angelus, Diane understood. Angelus, take a breath, she said. You don't have to process all of it today. Did have to process it, Angelus, because that night, Angelus, alone in my house, the same house where Michael had once measured his height against the doorframe in pencil, Angelus, where I had rocked him to sleep during thunderstorms, Angelus, where I had sat up with him the entire night before his SATs because he was too nervous to sleep alone. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder Diane had let me take home, Angelus, and I read every page again. Angelus, and again, as if reading it enough times might change what it said. Didn't change. I want to tell you about the days that followed, because I think if I skip past them, you won't understand how strange grief can be when the person you're grieving is still alive. I wasn't mourning a death. I was mourning a version of my son that I now understood might have never fully existed, or worse, Angelus, had existed once, Angelus, a long time ago, Angelus, and had slowly, quietly, Angelus, been replaced by someone I didn't recognize. I went about my normal routine because I didn't know what else to do. Angelus, I watered my garden. I went to my Tuesday book club, where my friend Margaret asked me twice if I was feeling all right, because apparently I'd been staring at the same page of The Nightingale for 20 minutes without turning it. Angelus, I told her I was just tired. Angelus, I have never been a good liar, Angelus, and I think Margaret knew it, Angelus, but she let it go, Angelus, the way good friends do when they sense you're not ready. Angelus, the hardest part was Michael's calls. He still called, Angelus, every few days, Angelus, cheerful, Angelus, oblivious, Angelus, asking how I was doing, Angelus, telling me about the business trip that had apparently gone well, Angelus, telling me Claire said hello. I answered those calls with a steadiness that shocked me. Angelus, I laughed at his jokes. Angelus, I asked about his flight home. Angelus, I said I love you at the end. Angelus, the way I always had. Angelus, and I meant it. That was the terrible part. Angelus, I still meant it even while a folder full of evidence sat in a drawer 3 feet from where I was standing. Angelus, you sound a little off, Mom. Angelus, he said once. Angelus, near the end of one of those calls. Angelus, everything okay? I remember gripping the phone and staring at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. Angelus, I'm fine, sweetheart, I said. Angelus, just getting older. Angelus, you know how it is. Angelus, he laughed. Angelus, you're not old, Mom. Angelus, don't say that. Angelus, I almost broke right there. Because it was such a small, Angelus, sweet thing to say. Angelus, the kind of thing a loving son says without thinking twice. Angelus, and I couldn't reconcile it with the man whose phone number showed up on a call log verifying stolen account details. Angelus, after I hung up. Angelus, I sat down on the kitchen floor, actually sat down. Angelus, right there on the tile. Angelus, because my legs didn't want to hold me anymore, and I let myself cry for the first time since this whole thing had started. Angelus, not delicate crying. Kind that comes up from somewhere old and makes an ugly sound. Angelus, I cried for the boy with the gap teeth. Cried for the version of this story where I never found those keys. Angelus, where I knocked on that door like I always had. Angelus, where none of this was ever revealed to me and I simply lived out my last years loved and oblivious. Angelus, robbed slowly and gently. Angelus, never knowing. For one terrible, honest moment, I wondered if that would have been better. Then I thought of my granddaughter and I stood back up. Angelus, Diane called again 2 days later. This time her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard before, something close to urgency. Evelyn, she said. Angelus, I need to ask you something. Angelus, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Angelus, all right. Has Michael or Claire mentioned anything to you recently about your house? Angelus, about selling it. Angelus, refinancing it. Angelus, putting it in a trust. Angelus, anything like that? Angelus, I frowned, trying to remember. Claire mentioned something a few months ago. About the house being too much for me to manage alone. She said it so casually I didn't think much of it. Angelus, do you remember when exactly? Closed my eyes, working backward through the calendar in my mind. Angelus, around the same time as the paperwork. Angelus, maybe a week or 2 before. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the particular silence of someone doing math. That fits a pattern I'm seeing, Diane said finally. I pulled records from the county assessor's office this morning. Someone requested a valuation on your property last month. My stomach dropped for what felt like the 100th time in 2 weeks, except this time it dropped somewhere deeper, somewhere that made me feel actually sick. Angelus, my house, I said. Angelus, they were pricing my house. Angelus, I can't confirm intent, Diane said, careful as always. But someone requested a market valuation on a property they don't legally own, using information that would have required either your cooperation or your identifying details. Angelus, it's the second one, I said. Angelus, my voice came out hoarse. Angelus, I never cooperated with anything like that. Angelus, I believe you, Diane said. And something about the simplicity of those 3 words, I believe you, undid something in me that all the evidence in the world hadn't managed to touch. Angelus, because for 2 weeks I had been quietly, Angelus, secretly afraid that somewhere, Angelus, deep down, Angelus, I was the one who was wrong. That I had misunderstood a conversation through a garage window. That grief and loneliness had turned me into a woman who saw betrayal in ordinary phone calls. Angelus, Diane's voice. Angelus, flat and certain. Angelus, telling me she believed me. Angelus, felt like being handed a rope in deep water. What do we do? I asked her, if they're already trying to sell the house out from under me. Angelus, we move faster than they expect, Diane said. I'm going to file protective paperwork this week, nothing that tips them off yet. Just internal locks on your accounts and a hold on your property records. And I want you to start writing everything down. Every conversation, every date, every detail you remember, no matter how small it feels. We're building a timeline, Evelyn, and timelines win cases. Angelus, I promised her I would. Angelus, and I did that same night. Angelus, I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and started at the beginning. Angelus, writing down every phone call. Angelus, every visit. Angelus, every strange little comment I had brushed off as nothing over the past year. Staggering, seeing it all lined up on paper. Angelus, alone each moment had seemed innocent. Together they formed something with teeth. March 14, Claire calls, asks if I've updated my will. March 22, Michael brings papers to sign, says nothing scary. April 9, Claire mentions the house feeling like a lot for me alone. May 2, Michael asks if I've thought about simplifying my accounts. June 18, Claire brings up a family friend who's a financial advisor, offers to set up a meeting. Angelus, that last one stopped me cold. I had forgotten about it entirely until I saw it written down. Claire had mentioned a financial advisor, a friend of hers, someone who could help me organize things. I remembered feeling flattered that she'd thought of me. I remembered telling her I'd think about it, Angelus, and never following up, Angelus, and her not pushing, Angelus, which at the time had felt like respect for my independence. Now it read like a step in a plan that simply hadn't been necessary to execute because they'd found an easier way in. Called Diane first thing the next morning and told her about the advisor. Angelus. She went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. Angelus, do you remember a name? She asked. Something like Angelus Whitmore Whitman. I struggled. Angelus, I only heard it once. I'll look into local advisors with ties to Meadowline Holdings, Diane said. Angelus, if there's a connection, we'll find it. Angelus, she called back that same afternoon. Angelus, faster than I expected. Angelus, and I could hear something different in her voice, not quite triumph, Angelus, but close to it. Angelus, the sound of a piece finally clicking into place. Warren Whitfield, no relation to me, unfortunate coincidence, runs a small advisory firm 2 towns over, she said. He's listed as a secondary contact on the Meadowline filing. Angelus, I sat down hard on the arm of my couch. Angelus, so Claire wasn't offering me a friend. She was trying to route me straight into the same operation. Angelus, that would be my read, yes. Angelus, I laughed, and it wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone realizing just how thoroughly she'd been underestimated. Angelus, my God, I said. Angelus, how long has this been planned? Based on the paper trail, Diane said slowly, I'd estimate at least a year. Angelus, maybe longer. A year. Michael and Claire had been sitting across from me at Sunday dinners, laughing at my jokes, letting my granddaughter fall asleep in my lap after too much cake for an entire year, while quietly building scaffolding around my life to take it apart piece by piece. Angelus, I don't cry easily in front of Angelus, but I was grateful, Angelus, in that moment, Angelus, that Diane was only a voice on a phone and couldn't see my face. Here is something no one tells you about betrayal from someone you love. It doesn't arrive all at once, even after you already know the truth. It arrives in waves, small, fresh cuts, opening every time some old, sweet memory reveals a second meaning you never noticed before. Angelus, I remembered, Angelus, a few nights later, Angelus, lying awake, Angelus, the Christmas from 2 years ago, when Claire had given me a beautiful leather organizer for my important documents, birth certificate, deed, Angelus, insurance papers, Angelus, all in one place. Angelus, at the time I had thought it was thoughtful. So practical of her, I'd told my friend Margaret. Angelus, she really thinks of everything. Now I lay in the dark, wondering if that organizer had ever really been a gift for me at all, Angelus, or if it had been the first quiet step in making sure everything important I owned was gathered in one convenient place, Angelus, easy to locate, Angelus, easy to photograph, Angelus, easy to access when the moment came. Angelus, I got up at 11 at night and went to find it. It was still in the drawer of my nightstand where I kept it, exactly as Claire had given it to me. I sat on the edge of my bed and went through every pocket, Angelus, every sleeve, Angelus, checking for anything missing, Angelus, anything out of order. Angelus, everything seemed to be there. But that didn't comfort me the way it should have. It only made me wonder what else had been photographed, copied, noted, Angelus, before being carefully placed back exactly where I would never think to look twice. Angelus, I brought the organizer to Diane the next day. She examined it carefully, turned it over in her hands, checked the seams like she was looking for something specific. I don't see anything altered, she said eventually. But I want you to start keeping your important documents somewhere new, Angelus, somewhere only you know about. You think they've seen everything in here. I think, Diane said carefully, that we should assume they have. That night I drove to a hardware store 40 minutes from my house, not the one near me, Angelus, where Michael or Claire might run into a neighbor who'd mention it, and I bought a small fireproof lockbox with a key I kept on a chain around my neck, Angelus, under my shirt, Angelus, against my skin, Angelus, where no one but me would ever know it was there. Angelus, I moved every important document into it. Angelus, my deed, my will before I rewrote it. Angelus, my bank information. My late husband's life insurance papers, the ones I had never let anyone else touch, not even Michael. I remember sitting on my bedroom floor that night with that little steel box in my lap, my hand resting on top of it, feeling something strange and new. Angelus, not safety. Angelus, safety felt too far away to reach yet. Angelus, but something adjacent to it. Something like the first solid foothold after a long fall. It was around this time, almost 3 weeks into everything, that Claire called and asked if she could come by for coffee. Just the two of us, she said, her voice as warm and easy as it had always been. I feel like we haven't really talked in a while, just us girls. Angelus, I sat with the phone against my ear, Angelus, staring at nothing, Angelus, and felt something in me go very still and very cold, Angelus, the way a lake freezes over from the edges inward. Angelus, of course, I said. Angelus, my voice came out exactly as warm as her. I didn't know I had that in me until I heard it. Angelus, I'd love that. Angelus, Thursday. Angelus, Thursday's perfect, Claire said. I'll bring those little lemon cookies you like. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a long time, feeling like I'd just agreed to invite a wolf to tea and call it a family visit. Angelus, I called Diane immediately. Angelus, she's coming Thursday, I said. Angelus, just the two of us. Angelus, Diane was quiet for a moment. Angelus, how do you feel about that? Angelus, sick, I admitted. Angelus, but I want to go through with it. Why? I thought about it honestly before I answered, because I owed myself an honest answer. Because I want to know, I said, if I can still tell when she's lying to my face. I want to see if I've gotten any smarter, or if I'm still the same fool who signed whatever was put in front of her. Angelus, you're not a fool, Evelyn. Angelus, Diane said, Angelus, and there was something firm in her voice that I needed to hear. A fool wouldn't have noticed a garage window conversation. Angelus, a fool wouldn't have hired me. You're the opposite of what they think you are. Just be careful you don't tip your hand before we're ready. Angelus, I won't, I said. Angelus, and I meant it, Angelus, though I had no idea yet how hard that promise would be to keep. Angelus, Thursday came faster than I wanted it to. I spent the morning cleaning my kitchen top to bottom, not because it needed it, but because my hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. Angelus, I put out the good cups. Angelus, the ones from my wedding china that I almost never used. Angelus, because some petty Angelus, wounded part of me wanted Claire to feel Angelus on some subconscious level. Angelus, that this was still my house. Angelus, still my rules. Angelus, still my table she was sitting at as a guest and not an owner in waiting. Angelus, she arrived at 11. Angelus, exactly on time. Angelus, wearing a soft yellow cardigan and carrying a small white box of lemon cookies tied with string. Angelus, smiling the same warm Angelus, easy smile she'd worn at every family dinner for the past 10 years. Angelus, she hugged me at the door. Angelus, and I hugged her back. Angelus, and I felt her arms around me and thought, Angelus, with a strange Angelus, detached clarity. Angelus, these are the same arms that hugged me at my husband's grave. You look wonderful, she said, stepping back to look at me. Have you done something different? You look. Angelus, I don't know, brighter somehow. Just been getting more sleep, I lied, smiling. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Michael had once laid out those papers with the yellow tabs, and I poured coffee into the good cups, Angelus, and for a moment, Angelus, just a moment, Angelus, it was almost easy to forget. Claire talked about my granddaughter's school play, about a recipe she wanted to try, about a trip she and Michael were hoping to take in the spring. Angelus, she laughed at her own jokes the way she always had. She reached across the table at one point and squeezed my hand, Angelus, and said, Angelus, I'm so glad we get moments like this, Mom. Angelus, you mean so much to us. I looked at her hand on mine and thought about the account opened in my name in March. Angelus, I thought about Meadowline Holdings, thought about the valuation request on my house. And I smiled and said, you mean so much to me too, sweetheart. It is a strange, terrible skill, learning to smile at someone while you catalog every lie they're telling you. Angelus, I don't recommend it. But I got very good at it, very fast. About 20 minutes in, she brought it up. She was casual about it, the way you'd mention the weather, stirring sugar into her coffee without quite meeting my eyes. Mom, I know this is probably not the fun conversation to have over cookies, she said, laughing lightly, but Michael and I have been talking, and we really do think it might be time to look at some options for the house. Angelus, nothing dramatic. Angelus, just thinking ahead. Making sure everything's set up the easy way instead of the hard way before anything ever becomes an issue. Angelus, there it was. Laid right out on my wedding china, sweet as the lemon cookies between us. Angelus, I felt something in my chest go very hard and very quiet, Angelus, and I heard myself say, Angelus, in a voice so calm it almost frightened me, Angelus, what kind of options were you thinking? Well, Claire said, Angelus, warming to the subject now, Angelus, leaning forward slightly, Angelus, there are some really lovely senior communities not too far from us. Warren, he's a financial advisor, a friend of mine. I mentioned him before he actually put together some numbers on what the house might be worth if we looked into selling. Angelus, just as an option, of course. Angelus, nothing's decided. We just want you to have choices. Angelus, I sat there holding my coffee cup, Angelus, looking at the woman across the table from me, Angelus, and I thought about how easily the lies came, Angelus, how smooth and practiced, Angelus, how she'd clearly said some version of this sentence before, Angelus, maybe even rehearsed it with Michael, the way I'd once rehearsed the joke I never got to make on that garden path. Angelus, that's very thoughtful, I said. Angelus, Warren already ran numbers on my house? Something flickered behind Claire's eyes, so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. Angelus, just preliminary, she said quickly. Angelus, nothing official. How would he even know what to look at, I asked. Angelus, still smiling. Angelus, still stirring my coffee like this was the most casual conversation in the world. Angelus, without access to the property records. Angelus, there was a beat of silence. Angelus, just one beat. Angelus, but I saw it. I saw the exact moment Claire realized she'd said something she shouldn't have. Angelus, I think Michael mentioned it to him. Angelus, she said. Angelus, recovering fast. Angelus, too fast. Angelus, you know how these things go. Angelus, people talk. Angelus, of course, I said. Angelus, people do talk. Angelus, we finished the coffee. Talked about the school play again. Angelus, she left an hour later with another hug. Angelus, another I love you, Mom. Angelus, another warm smile that I now understood was a mask so practiced it had become a second face. Stood at my door and watched her drive away, Angelus, and the moment her car turned the corner, Angelus, I went straight to my phone and called Diane, Angelus, my hands finally, Angelus, blessedly, Angelus, shaking again not from fear this time, Angelus, but from something closer to fury, Angelus, clean and useful. She just told me, I said, Angelus, the words tumbling out fast, Angelus, that a financial advisor already ran numbers on my house. Angelus, before I ever agreed to anything. Angelus, before anyone ever asked me. Angelus, did she say his name? Angelus, Warren, the same Warren. I heard something shift in Diane's voice, sharp, alert, almost eager. Angelus, that's not speculation anymore, Evelyn. Angelus, that's evidence of intent. Angelus, write down everything she said. Angelus, word for word. Angelus, as close as you can remember. Angelus, right now while it's fresh. Angelus, I sat down at the kitchen table. Angelus, in the chair Claire had just vacated. Angelus, her coffee cup still sitting there with a faint lipstick print on the rim. Angelus, and I wrote every word I could remember. Angelus, my pen moving fast. Angelus, my hand steady now in a way it hadn't been in weeks. Because somewhere over that hour of lemon cookies and lies, something in me had finished changing. I was no longer the woman standing frozen outside a garage window, afraid to knock. I was no longer even the woman crying on her kitchen floor. Angelus, I was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who could smile and pour coffee and gather evidence at the Sable, where her family was quietly plotting to take her whole life apart. Angelus, and though I didn't know it yet, Angelus, sitting there with my pen moving across that yellow legal pad, Angelus, I was only days away from the moment everything would finally, Angelus, completely, Angelus, come apart, the moment Diane would call me one last time before the meeting, Angelus, her voice tight with something I hadn't heard from her before, Angelus, and say the words that would change the shape of this entire story, Evelyn, I think there's something much bigger going on here than the house. I think you need to sit down before I tell you the rest. Diane's words sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. I think there's something much bigger going on here than the house. I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't say more over the phone. Not like this, she said. Come in tomorrow morning. Angelus, first thing. I don't want you driving home upset after dark. Angelus, I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with my hand resting on the little steel lockbox I now kept on my nightstand, running my thumb over the cold metal edge, trying to imagine what could possibly be bigger than what I already knew. My son verifying stolen account details with my bank. My daughter-in-law forming a company to receive my money. A financial advisor pricing my house before I'd agreed to sell it. What was left? What was the thing so large that Diane Whitfield, a woman who had never once raised her voice in my presence, needed to tell me sitting down? Angelus, I got to her office 20 minutes early. Angelus, I sat in my car in the parking lot. Angelus, watching the light change in the windows of her building. Angelus, rehearsing ways to brace myself for whatever was coming. Angelus, and none of them worked. When I finally walked in, Diane was already at her desk, and I noticed immediately that she hadn't laid out any folders this time. Angelus, she'd cleared the desk entirely. Angelus, just her laptop closed. Angelus, and 2 cups of coffee she must have made specifically because she knew I'd need something to hold on to. Angelus, sit, she said. Angelus, gentler than usual. I want to start by saying I don't know everything yet, Diane said. But I know enough that I couldn't wait to tell you, because I think it changes how we move forward, and I think it changes what you're dealing with. Angelus, just tell me, I said. Angelus, my voice came out steadier than I felt. She opened the laptop and turned it toward me. Angelus, on the screen was a name I did not recognize. Angelus, a woman's name. Angelus, Eleanor Voss. Who is that? I asked. Eleanor Voss was 73 years old, Diane said. Angelus, she lived 2 counties over. Angelus, she passed away last spring. I felt something cold move through me even before I understood why. I don't understand what this has to do with. Warren Whitfield was her financial advisor, Diane said. Angelus, for the last 2 years of her life. Angelus, the room went very quiet. I heard the hum of the air conditioner. Angelus, I heard my own heartbeat. Eleanor Voss's son, Diane continued, was named as a beneficiary on several accounts that were restructured about 8 months before she died. Her house was sold 6 weeks before her death to a holding company. Angelus, similar structure to Meadowline. Angelus, different name. Angelus, same filing agent. Angelus, I put my hand over my mouth. Are you telling me, I said slowly, that this has happened before? I'm telling you, Diane said, that I don't think Warren Whitfield is a financial advisor who happened to get pulled into your family's plan. Angelus, I think your family may have been pulled into his. Angelus, I sat there absorbing that. Angelus, feeling the shape of everything shift underneath me again. Angelus, the way it had in the driveway that first day. Angelus, the way it had reading those documents at my kitchen table. Angelus, the way it had hearing Claire lie to my face over lemon cookies. Except this time it wasn't just about my son and his wife anymore. This was something bigger, something that had a pattern stretching back before I had ever found those keys. Something with a body count that might not have stopped at money. Did she have family looking into what happened to her? I asked. Eleanor, did anyone ever question it? Angelus, Diane's face did something complicated. Angelus, her daughter tried, she said. Angelus, for about 8 months. Angelus, then the daughter dropped it. Why, I don't know yet, Diane admitted. Angelus, but I have her number. If you're willing, I'd like to reach out. Angelus, carefully, quietly. I nodded before I'd even fully thought it through, because something in me, some old stubborn instinct that had kept me upright through every hard year of my life, had already decided. Angelus, I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. This man had done this before. If there was a woman out there whose family had crumbled the same way mine was crumbling, I wanted to know. Angelus, I needed to know. Angelus, do it, I said. Angelus, call her. Diane reached the daughter 3 days later. Angelus, her name was Patricia. Angelus, and according to Diane, Angelus, she'd been hesitant at first. Angelus, guarded in the particular way of someone who has been burned badly enough to stop trusting even people trying to help her. But something about Diane's approach, careful, patient, unhurried, got her talking eventually. Diane relayed the conversation to me over the phone that evening, and I sat in my kitchen with a notepad, writing down every detail like it was scripture. Patricia says her mother started acting differently about a year before she died, Diane said. Suddenly interested in protecting the family, suddenly convinced her affairs needed restructuring. Tricia thought it was strange, Angelus, but her brother Eleanor's son kept telling her not to worry, Angelus, that Warren had everything handled, Angelus, that Mom trusted him. That sounds familiar, I said quietly, thinking of Michael's voice through that garage window. Angelus, but she trusts us. Angelus, there's more, Diane said. Tricia says her brother and Warren had known each other for years before any of this started. Business associates. Tricia never knew exactly what kind of business. What happened to the money, I asked. Angelus, after the house sold. Angelus, Patricia doesn't know, Diane said. She says she tried to get answers, hired her own attorney for a while, but eventually her brother stopped speaking to her entirely. Said she was tearing the family apart over paranoid accusations. Their mother died a few months later. Tricia says the funeral was the last time she saw him. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something heavy settle into my stomach. She lost her mother and her brother, I said. Both because she asked questions. Angelus, that's what it sounds like, Diane said. And you think that's what's waiting for me? Diane didn't answer right away, and her silence was its own kind of answer. I think, she said finally, that the people running this operation are counting on families falling apart before anyone gets close enough to stop them. Angelus, I think it's worked before. Angelus, I don't intend to let it work again. I hung up the phone that night and sat alone in my living room for a long time, Angelus, staring at a photograph on my mantel. Michael at 8 years old, Angelus, missing his front teeth, Angelus, grinning up at the camera on the day his father taught him to ride a bike without training wheels. Angelus, I thought about Patricia, Angelus, a woman I had never met, Angelus, who had lost her mother and then lost her brother on top of it, Angelus, simply for refusing to look away. I thought about how easy it would be to do the same thing, to let this go, Angelus, to accept whatever explanation Michael offered, Angelus, to keep the peace, Angelus, to keep my son, Angelus, even if keeping him meant losing myself piece by piece the way Eleanor Voss apparently had. I decided right there in that quiet room that I would rather lose Michael than lose myself. The hardest decision I had ever made, Angelus, and I made it in under a minute, Angelus, because somewhere over the last 3 weeks, Angelus, some deep and long-buried part of me had already been preparing for it. The next development came faster than I expected, and it came from a place I hadn't anticipated at all. My daughter, Rachel. Angelus. Rachel lived 2 hours away, Angelus, in a small apartment with her cat and her nursing job and a life that had always felt, to me, Angelus, blessedly separate from whatever complications Michael got himself into. She'd never been as close to Michael as I might have hoped. There had always been a quiet distance between them, something neither of them ever fully explained, something I'd chalked up to ordinary sibling friction and never pushed on. Called me on a Sunday evening, her voice tight in a way I immediately recognized as trouble. Angelus, Mom, she said. Has Michael said anything to you about money lately? Anything strange? Angelus, I felt my whole body go still. Angelus, why are you asking me that? Angelus, there was a pause. Called me last week, Rachel said, and asked if I'd be willing to sign something. Angelus, a document. He said it was just a formality, something about family estate planning, and that it would make things simpler if I signed off on some things regarding your care. Angelus, my hand tightened around the phone. Angelus, what kind of document? Angelus, I don't know exactly, Rachel said. Angelus, he didn't send it. He just asked if I'd be willing, in general, if he sent something over. Angelus, I told him I'd need to see it first, and he got weird about it. Angelus, kind of pushy. Angelus, it wasn't like him. Angelus, I closed my eyes. Angelus, of course. Of course they would need Rachel too. Angelus, eventually a sibling's signature carries weight. Angelus, lends legitimacy. Angelus, closes gaps a court might otherwise question. I hadn't even considered that my daughter might be pulled into this, and the thought of it made me feel sick in an entirely new way. Rachel, I said carefully. Angelus, I need to tell you something, Angelus, and I need you to sit down. Angelus, I told her everything. Angelus, the keys, the garage window. Angelus, the documents. Angelus, Meadowline Holdings. Angelus, Warren Whitfield. Angelus, Eleanor Voss. Angelus, I told her all of it in one. Angelus, breathless unraveling. Angelus, and by the end of it, Angelus, Rachel was crying on the other end of the phone. Angelus, and so was I. I'm coming this weekend, she said, once she could speak again. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not letting you go through this alone. You don't have to drop everything for me, I said. Angelus, though even as I said it, Angelus, I felt how badly I needed her to. Angelus, Mom, Rachel said. Angelus, her voice suddenly fierce in a way that reminded me, Angelus, painfully, Angelus, of myself at her age. Angelus, I am not losing you the way I think Michael is trying to make sure I do. Angelus, I'm coming. She arrived that Saturday morning with a duffel bag and a look on her face I hadn't seen since she was a teenager standing up to a boy who'd broken her heart, a mixture of hurt and steel that made her look, for just a moment, exactly like her father. Angelus, we sat at the kitchen table together. Angelus, the same table. Angelus, and I laid out everything Diane had found. Angelus, spread across the surface like a map of a war I hadn't known I was fighting. Rachel read through it slowly, her jaw tightening more with every page, until she finally set the papers down and looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Angelus, Mom, she said quietly, there's something I never told you. Angelus, about Michael. Angelus, about why we've always been distant. Angelus, my stomach dropped. Angelus, what do you mean? Rachel took a breath, the kind of breath you take before you say something you've been holding for a very long time. Angelus, a few years ago, Angelus, she said. Angelus, right after Dad's estate finished settling. Angelus, Michael asked me to help him convince you to combine some of your accounts. Easier for tax purposes. I told him no. I told him it felt wrong going around you like that, instead of just asking you directly. She paused. Angelus, he got so angry, Mom. Angelus, angrier than I'd ever seen him. Told me I was being difficult, that I was going to make things harder for the whole family. We didn't talk for almost 6 months after that. I sat there absorbing this, feeling something crack open in my chest, grief layered over grief, betrayal reaching back years further than I'd understood. Didn't you tell me? I whispered. 'Cause I didn't want to believe it either, Rachel said, her eyes filling. I told myself he was just stressed, that it was a one-time thing, that bringing it to you would only hurt you for nothing. I was protecting you from something I didn't even fully understand yet. She wiped her eyes roughly. Angelus, I'm sorry, Mom. Angelus, I should have told you years ago. Maybe none of this would have gotten this far. I reached across the table and took her hand, the way I used to when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. Angelus, you didn't do this, I told her. Angelus, they did. Angelus, don't you dare carry this. But even as I said it, I felt the true scope of what we were dealing with settling over me like a physical weight. This wasn't a mistake Michael had made once under pressure in a moment of financial stress. Angelus, this was years in the making. This was a pattern that had started long before Claire ever came into the picture, one she may have simply recognized in him and known exactly how to use. Diane called 2 days later with news that made my hands shake for an entirely different reason. I found the connection, Angelus, she said. Angelus, and I could hear something in her voice that was almost triumphant. Angelus, sharp and clean. Warren Whitfield and Michael didn't meet through Claire. Angelus, they met 4 years ago. A business conference. I found an old photo on an archived event page, the two of them shaking hands at a networking mixer. Angelus, 4 years, I repeated slowly. Angelus, before Claire even mentioned him to me. Before Claire even married Michael, if the math is right, Diane said. Angelus, I think Warren has been circling your family for a long time, Evelyn. Michael might not just be someone he pulled in. Michael might have been the one who brought Warren to Claire. Angelus, the floor tilted again. Angelus, the way it kept doing. Angelus, over and over. Angelus, every time I thought I'd found the bottom of this. You're saying my son, I said slowly, might be more responsible for this than his wife. Angelus, I'm saying, Angelus, Diane said carefully, Angelus, that I don't think there's an innocent party in this arrangement anymore, Evelyn. I think you need to prepare yourself for that. Angelus, I hung up the phone and sat in my living room for a long time. Angelus, staring at that photograph on my mantel again, Michael at 8. Angelus, gap-toothed. Angelus, delighted. Angelus, learning to ride a bicycle with his father's hands steady on the seat behind him. I thought about every version of my son I had loved across 61 years, Angelus, and I wondered, Angelus, for the first time, Angelus, honestly and without flinching, Angelus, how much of the boy in that photograph had ever really grown into the man I thought I knew, Angelus, and how much of that man had been an elaborate performance, Angelus, built specifically for an audience of one. Angelus, me. Rachel stayed for 2 weeks. In that time, Angelus, she and Diane and I built something I can only describe as a war room, my dining table covered in printouts, Angelus, timelines, Angelus, bank statement, Angelus, a corkboard Rachel bought at an office supply store and hung in my spare bedroom, Angelus, red string connecting dates and names the way you'd see in a detective movie, Angelus, except this wasn't a movie. This was my life unraveling and reassembling itself into a shape I never wanted to see. We learned that Meadowline Holdings had a sister entity, formed only 2 months earlier, called Brookstone Family Trust, a name so deliberately warm and reassuring it made me want to be sick every time I read it. Diane discovered that Brookstone had been the recipient of 3 more small transfers, each one carefully sized to stay under a reporting threshold that would have triggered automatic bank flags. They know the rules, Diane said grimly, laying out the transaction dates. Angelus, this isn't improvisation. This is someone who has done this enough times to know exactly how to stay under the radar. Angelus, Warren, I said. Angelus, Warren, Diane confirmed. We learned too, Angelus, through records Diane was able to access with my authorization, Angelus, that Michael's own business, the one I had been so proud of, Angelus, the one I bragged about at church, Angelus, at the salon, Angelus, to anyone who would listen, had been quietly struggling for the better part of a year. Angelus, late payments to 2 vendors. Angelus, a line of credit maxed out and renegotiated twice. A business that, on paper, looked nothing like the picture Michael had for me every time we spoke. He's in trouble, Rachel said quietly, staring at the printouts spread across my dining table. Angelus, this isn't just greed, Mom. Angelus, I think he's desperate. Angelus, I felt something twist in me, Angelus, something that wanted, Angelus, even now, Angelus, even after everything, Angelus, to soften toward my son. Angelus, desperation was at least human. Desperation I could almost understand, even if I couldn't forgive what he'd done with it. Doesn't excuse it, I said, more to myself than to Rachel. Angelus, no, she agreed. Angelus, it doesn't. But it might explain why he let Claire and Warren lead him somewhere he never would have gone on his own. Angelus, I wanted to believe that. Angelus, God help me. Angelus, some small, Angelus, stubborn, Angelus. Motherly part of me wanted so badly to believe that my son had been desperate and frightened and led astray, Angelus, rather than someone who, Angelus, according to Diane's timeline, Angelus, been laying groundwork with Warren Whitfield since 4 years before I ever found those keys on my counter. But wanting to believe something and having evidence to support it are 2 very different things, Angelus, and I had spent the last 3 weeks learning, Angelus, painfully, Angelus, the difference between the 2. Was Rachel, who found the piece that changed everything, the piece that turned this from a slow, cold discovery into an emergency. She'd been going through old emails I'd forwarded her over the years, Angelus, family photos, Angelus, holiday plans, Angelus, nothing important, Angelus, when she stopped scrolling and went very still. Angelus, Mom, she said. Angelus, come look at this. Angelus, I came around the table and looked over her shoulder at an email from 8 months earlier, one Claire had sent to the whole family, Angelus, cheerful, casual, Angelus, about planning my birthday party. Angelus, nothing unusual on the surface. But Rachel had noticed something in the metadata, some technical detail she understood from her work with hospital record systems that I would never have caught in 100 years. This email was sent from an account linked to a shared calendar, Rachel said. Angelus, a calendar called Evelyn Transition Plan. Angelus, my blood went cold. Angelus, a transition plan. Angelus, I don't have access to it. Angelus, Rachel said. Angelus, already typing. Angelus, her fingers moving fast across the keyboard. Angelus, but the calendar exists. Angelus, it's linked to Claire's email. If it's shared with other people, I might be able to see who. Diane arrived within the hour Rachel had called her the moment she found it, and the 3 of us sat around my dining table while Diane worked through the technical permissions, with a focus so intense I almost didn't recognize her calm, measured voice when she finally spoke. Shared with 3 people, Diane said slowly, reading from her screen. Angelus, Claire, Michael. Angelus, she paused. Angelus and Warren Whitfield. Angelus, the room went silent. Angelus, I felt my pulse in my throat. Angelus, can you see what's in it? I asked. Angelus, the calendar itself. Angelus, not the details, Diane said. Angelus, but I can see event titles. Angelus, and dates. She scrolled slowly, her face tightening with each line. There's an event 2 months from now. Angelus, finalized transfer EP. Angelus, EP, my initials. I sat back in my chair, feeling the air leave my lungs, silent exhale. Angelus, 2 months. Angelus, they had a date. My own family had a deadline circled on a calendar for the completion of whatever this was, and I had stumbled onto the truth with barely enough time to stop it. There's something else, Angelus, Diane said. Angelus, her voice careful now. Angelus, the way it had been the day she told me about Eleanor Voss. Angelus, there's an earlier event. Angelus, 3 weeks from now. She looked up at me. Angelus, title reads Guardianship Consultation. Angelus, I felt the blood drain completely from my face. Guardianship, I repeated. They're not just trying to take my money. They're planning to have me declared incompetent. That would fit the pattern, Diane said quietly. It would explain the timeline being pushed. Angelus, if they can establish diminished capacity, Angelus, even informally, Angelus, even just enough to raise doubt in a courtroom, Angelus, it makes every prior document harder for you to contest. It gives them legal cover for everything that's already happened, and everything's still planned. Rachel made a sound I'd never heard her make before, something between a gasp and a sob, sharp and furious. They were going to have you declared incompetent, she said. Mom, they were going to take away your right to make your own decisions. Angelus, on purpose. While you're standing right here, Angelus, completely lucid, Angelus, completely capable, Angelus, running circles around all of them without them even knowing it. Letting that truth settle into every part of me. Not just theft, Angelus, not just deception. Angelus, an attempt to erase my voice entirely. Angelus, to make it so that nothing I said, Angelus, no matter how true, Angelus, could ever be believed again in a court of law. Angelus, it was, I realized slowly, Angelus, the most complete betrayal a person could construct, not just taking what I had, Angelus, but taking the ability to object to having it taken. Angelus, we moved the timeline up, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt, steady in the particular way that comes only after fear has burned all the way through and left something harder behind it. We don't wait for their meeting. Angelus, we call our own. Diane looked at me for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind her careful professional expression. Angelus, are you sure you're ready for that? I thought about Eleanor Voss, a woman I had never met, whose family had fractured beyond repair, chasing the same truth I was standing in the middle of right now. I thought about Patricia, still grieving a mother and a brother both, still living with unanswered questions. Angelus, I thought about my granddaughter, Angelus, 7 years old, Angelus, who called me Grandma Evie and didn't yet know that the adults around her had been quietly deciding, Angelus, behind closed doors, Angelus, what her family's future would look like without ever asking the one person it belonged to. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, I said. We spent the next several days preparing with a precision I didn't know I was capable of. Diane gathered every document, Angelus, every transaction record, Angelus, every piece of the guardianship calendar event she could legally access, Angelus, building a case as thick and undeniable as a brick wall. Rachel stayed by my side through all of it, Angelus, sleeping in her childhood bedroom down the hall, Angelus, making coffee in the mornings, Angelus, sitting beside me at that dining table covered in red string and printed dates, Angelus, a constant, Angelus, steady presence that reminded me I hadn't lost everyone. Diane insisted the meeting happen on neutral ground, not my house, Angelus, not Michael's, Angelus, somewhere with no history, Angelus, no comfortable memories either side could use against the other. She booked a small conference room at her office building, sterile and quiet, with a long table and fluorescent lights that made everything feel official in a way that suited exactly what this needed to be. Don't warn them, Angelus, Diane said, Angelus, the night before, Angelus, sitting across from me at my kitchen table one last time before everything changed. Don't give them a chance to prepare a story. Invite them under the pretense of discussing family planning, just like they've always framed it to you. Let them walk in thinking they're still in control. Angelus, and then I asked. And then, Diane said, sliding the final folder across the table to me, thick with everything we'd found, you let the truth do what truth always does when it's finally allowed into the room. Called Michael that evening, my hand steady on the phone in a way that would have astonished the woman I'd been just a month earlier. Angelus, sweetheart, I said. Angelus, my voice warm, easy. Angelus, exactly as it had always been. Angelus, exactly as Claire's had sounded over lemon cookies. I'd like to sit down with you and Claire. Talk about some family planning. Angelus, get everyone on the same page. Pause on the line, brief. Angelus, almost imperceptible. Angelus, and then Michael's voice came back. Please, Angelus. Relieved, Angelus, utterly unsuspecting. Angelus, that's great, Mom, he said. Angelus, that's really great. We've been hoping you'd be open to talking this through properly. Angelus, I think it's time, I said. Angelus, I really do. I hung up the phone and sat alone in my kitchen for a long moment, feeling something settle over me that was equal parts grief and resolve. Somewhere across town, my son was almost certainly turning to his wife with relief in his voice, telling her his mother was finally ready to sign whatever they needed her to sign. He had no idea that the woman he thought he knew, trusting, unguarded, easy to lead, no longer existed. Angelus, she had died quietly, somewhere between a garage window and a steel lockbox, and in her place stood someone he had never once had to reckon with. Angelus, 3 days later. Angelus, I put on the navy blue dress I usually saved for church. Angelus, the one that made me feel like myself on my best days. Angelus, and I drove to Diane's office with Rachel in the passenger seat and a folder in my lap thick enough to end everything I thought I understood about my family. I remember sitting in the parking lot for a moment before we went in, my hands resting on top of that folder, feeling my heart pound steady and hard against my ribs. Rachel reached over and took my hand. Angelus, you ready? She asked. I looked at the building in front of me, Angelus, at the glass doors reflecting a woman in a navy dress who barely resembled the one who had stood frozen outside a garage window a month before, Angelus, and I felt something settle into place inside me, Angelus, cold and clear and absolutely certain. Angelus, I've been ready my whole life, I said. Angelus, I just didn't know it yet. Angelus, we walked inside together, Angelus, and somewhere down that hallway, Angelus, in a conference room with fluorescent lights and a long table, Angelus, my son and his wife were already waiting for a meeting they thought they understood. They had no idea it was the last conversation where they would ever hold the upper hand in my life again. Rachel's hand slipped out of mine at the door, but her presence stayed behind me like a wall as we walked into that conference room. Diane was already there, Angelus, seated at the head of the long table, Angelus, folders stacked neatly in front of her, Angelus, her laptop open but angled away from view. Across from her, exactly where I knew they'd be, sat Michael and Claire. Michael stood up the second he saw me, that same easy smile on his face, the one I'd known since he was small. Angelus, Mom, he said, coming around the table to hug me. You look great. Angelus, I let him hug me. Angelus, I felt his arms around me, and Angelus, for one traitorous second, Angelus, my body remembered 30 years of hugs just like this one, Angelus, and some old, Angelus, tired part of me wanted to sink into it and forget everything I now knew. But I kept my spine straight, and when he pulled back, I was already looking past him at Claire. Angelus, she was smiling too, Angelus, rising to greet me with her arms already open, Angelus, wearing a soft blue blouse that made her look younger than she was, softer, safer. Angelus, Mom, she said warmly, I'm so glad you wanted to do this. I really think it's time we all got on the same page. Angelus, I agree, I said. Angelus, my voice came out even. Calm, nothing at all like the storm underneath it. Angelus, I think it's long past time. Michael and Claire on one side of the table, Angelus, Rachel beside me on the other, Angelus, Diane at the head, Angelus, a folder in front of each of us except theirs. I noticed Michael glance at the folders with mild curiosity, the way you'd notice paperwork at any ordinary meeting, nothing that told him yet what was coming. Angelus, so Michael said, Angelus, folding his hands on the table, Angelus, glancing at Claire and then back at me with an expression that was trying very hard to look casual. Mom, Angelus, we really appreciate you being open to this. I know these conversations aren't easy, but Claire and I have just been worried about you being out there on your own, especially with the house and everything. Angelus, Michael, I said quietly, I want to ask you something before we go any further. Angelus, he blinked, caught slightly off guard by my tone. Angelus, of course. Do you remember the afternoon you left your spare keys on my kitchen counter? Before your business trip to Ohio? Angelus, his brow furrowed slightly. Angelus, sure, I forgot them in a rush. Angelus, why, I drove them over to you, I said. Angelus, you weren't in Ohio yet. Angelus, your car was in the driveway. I watched something flicker behind his eyes, a small, uncertain shift, like a man realizing the ground under him wasn't quite as solid as he'd assumed. Angelus, beside him, Claire had gone very still. Angelus, I heard voices in the garage. Angelus, I continued. Angelus, my voice steady. Angelus, almost gentle. Angelus, the way you'd deliver news you'd already grieved. Angelus, I heard you, Michael. Angelus, and I heard Claire. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I have ever experienced in my life. Mom, Michael said carefully, I don't. Angelus, I heard her say. Angelus, I went on. Angelus, not raising my voice. Angelus, not needing to. Angelus, that once I signed the final documents. Angelus, everything would be much easier. Angelus, and I heard you say, I trust you. And I heard her say, that's exactly why this will work. Claire's face had gone pale, her hand frozen halfway to the coffee cup in front of her. Michael's jaw tightened, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Angelus, Mom, Michael finally said. Angelus, his voice strained. Angelus, that's not what it sounded like. We were talking about the estate planning stuff, that's all. We were trying to figure out the best way to bring it up to you without. Without what, Michael, I asked. Without me asking questions, without me reading the fine print? Angelus, that's not fair, Claire said quickly, finding her voice. We've only ever wanted to help you, Mom. You're getting older. You're alone in that house. We were just trying to make things easier. Easier for who, I asked. Question landed heavier than I expected, and I watched it land, watched Claire's mouth open and then close again without an answer ready. Angelus, I nodded to Diane. She opened the first folder and slid it across the table, the way she'd done for me weeks earlier in her office, except this time it wasn't me on the receiving end of the truth. Angelus, this is a power of attorney document. Angelus, Diane said. Angelus, her voice calm. Angelus, professional. Angelus, utterly without malice. Angelus, which somehow made it worse for them than if she'd been angry. Angelus, signed by Evelyn in March. Grants extraordinarily broad financial authority far beyond what's typical for the kind of protective paperwork you described to her. Angelus, Michael's eyes moved over the page. I watched him read it as though for the first time, though I knew he'd read every word of it back in March, had probably helped draft the language himself. Mom, this was just to protect you, he said. Angelus, not looking up. Angelus, in case anything happened. Angelus, then why? Diane asked. Angelus, sliding the second page forward. Angelus, was it drafted to activate immediately? Angelus, rather than upon a determination of incapacity. Angelus, silence. Angelus, and why? She continued. Angelus, sliding a third page across. Angelus, was an account opened in Evelyn's name in March that she has no memory of authorizing. Claire's hand had started to tremble slightly around her coffee cup. Michael was staring at the page in front of him like it might change if he looked at it long enough. There's a phone call linked to the verification of that account, Angelus, Diane said. Angelus, her tone still even. Angelus, still measured. Placed from Michael's cell phone. Angelus, Michael's head snapped up. That's I don't that could have been anything. That doesn't prove. It proves, I said quietly, that you called my bank and pretended to verify my ISH information so that account could be opened without my knowledge. Angelus, Mom, I swear. Angelus, it wasn't like that. Angelus, Michael said. Angelus, and his voice cracked slightly. Angelus, the first real crack I'd heard in him since we sat down. I was trying to help set things up the right way. I didn't think. Angelus, you didn't think I'd find out, I said. That's the part you didn't think through, isn't it? Angelus, he didn't answer. He looked, Angelus, for just a moment. Angelus, like the boy who used to get caught sneaking cookies before dinner. Angelus, except this wasn't cookies. Angelus, and I wasn't going to laugh this one off with a gentle scolding and a hug. Diane slid the next set of documents across the table, and I watched Claire's face change completely as she read the name at the top. Angelus, Meadowline Holdings, L. This is a company formed 8 months ago, Diane said. Angelus, Claire is listed as the managing member. Several transfers from Evelyn's accounts have moved into this entity over the past 6 months, each one structured to stay just under the threshold that would trigger a bank's automatic reporting. That's not, Claire started, but her voice failed her halfway through the sentence. Angelus, that's not what? Angelus, I asked, and I heard something in my own voice now. Angelus, something that had been building for weeks. Angelus, finally finding its way to the surface. That's not what it looks like? Because it looks, Claire, exactly like what it is. It looks like you built a company specifically to receive money quietly siphoned out of my accounts. It looks like you've been planning this for a very long time. Angelus, Mom, please. Angelus, Claire said. Angelus, and there were tears in her eyes now. Angelus, real ones. Angelus, or good enough imitations that I genuinely couldn't tell the difference anymore. Angelus, and that uncertainty itself felt like its own kind of grief. You have to understand, things have been really hard for us. Michael's business has been struggling, Angelus, and we panicked, Angelus. And Warren said there were ways to protect the family assets that would keep everything safe, Angelus, and it just got complicated so fast, and Angelus, Warren, I repeated, Angelus, and I watched both their faces change at the mention of his name, Angelus, a flicker of something like fear passing between them. Angelus, let's talk about Warren. Diane opened the next folder, and I watched Michael's face go from pale to something closer to gray. Angelus, Warren Whitfield, Diane said. Angelus, financial advisor. Also connected to a woman named Eleanor Voss, deceased last spring, whose estate followed a strikingly similar pattern to what's happened here. Angelus, restructured accounts. A house sold to a holding company 6 weeks before her death. Angelus, a son who benefited. A daughter who was cut out of the family for asking questions. Angelus, the room went utterly silent. I watched Michael's hands, which had been resting on the table, curl slowly into fists. I met Warren 4 years ago, Michael said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Angelus, at a conference. Before Claire and I were even engaged. Angelus, I felt my chest tighten. Angelus, 4 years, I repeated. So this didn't start with the business struggling. Didn't start with panic. Angelus, this started long before any of that. Angelus, Michael didn't answer. His eyes had dropped to the table, and for the first time since we'd sat down, he looked like a man who understood exactly how much rope he'd run out of. Michael, I said, Angelus, and something in my voice must have carried the full weight of everything I'd been holding for weeks. Angelus, because he looked up at me finally. Angelus, really looked at me. Angelus, did you bring Warren to Claire? Angelus, or did Claire bring him to you? Question hung in the air like something physical. Claire turned to look at Michael, waiting, Angelus, and in that single look I saw something that told me more than any document. Diane had gathered a flash of genuine uncertainty, Angelus, as though even she wasn't entirely sure what the honest answer was anymore. Angelus, as though the two of them had spent so long building this story together that neither of them fully remembered which one of them had struck the match. It doesn't matter, Michael said finally, his voice hollow. Angelus, it doesn't matter who started it. Angelus, it matters to me, I said. Angelus, he was quiet for a long moment. Angelus, staring down at the table. Angelus, and when he finally spoke, Angelus, his voice had lost all its earlier polish. Angelus, all its rehearsed warmth. Warren at a business conference, he said. Angelus, he seemed like he knew everyone worth knowing. We started talking, and he asked about family, about you, about whether you had assets that weren't being optimized. That's the word he used. Optimized. Michael let out a short, humorless laugh. I didn't think anything of it at first. Angelus, it was just conversation. Wasn't just conversation, I said. Angelus, no, Michael admitted. Angelus, not after a while. Angelus, he kept bringing it up. Angelus, every time we talked. Asking how you were doing, whether you'd thought about your estate, whether I'd thought about what happens to the house someday. And then the business started struggling, and he had all these solutions. Ways to access family resources without anyone having to feel like they were asking for a handout. His voice cracked again. Angelus, it felt like he was helping. It felt like a way to fix things without ever having to sit across from you and admit I'd failed. I felt something in my chest crack wide open, not forgiveness, not yet, Angelus, but something adjacent to understanding, Angelus. The terrible, Angelus, complicated understanding a mother has for a child who has done something unforgivable for reasons that are, Angelus, underneath it all, Angelus, painfully human. You could have told me, I said quietly. You could have come to me and told me the business was struggling. Angelus, I would have helped you, Michael. I would have found a way. Angelus, I know, he said, Angelus, and his voice broke completely this time, Angelus, and for a moment he looked exactly like the boy who used to cry over lost checkers games, Angelus, except now the stakes were so much higher, Angelus, and the tears came too late to change anything. Angelus, I know that now. Angelus, but at the time it felt easier to let Warren handle it. Angelus, it felt like I wouldn't have to face you, like I wouldn't have to see the disappointment. And instead I said you decided it would be easier to just take it, Angelus, without ever having to face me at all. He didn't answer that. There was nothing left to say to it. Angelus, I turned to Claire, Angelus, whose tears had stopped somewhere in the last few minutes, Angelus, replaced by something harder, Angelus, more defensive. Angelus, and you, I said. Angelus, what's your excuse? I don't have one, she's surprising me. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I didn't know what I was doing, Mom. Angelus, I did. I knew exactly what Meadowline was for. I knew exactly what those transfers were. Her chin lifted slightly, something almost defiant crossing her face. But I'm not going to apologize for wanting security for my family. Angelus, for my daughter. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your husband's business fall apart and know there's a solution sitting right there, and just not take it because it feels wrong? Angelus, yes, I said quietly. Angelus, I do, actually. Because I've spent my whole life making hard choices the right way instead of the easy way. Angelus, I raised Michael alone after his father died. I built everything I have from nothing, one careful decision at a time, and I never once thought about taking a shortcut through someone else's trust to get there. Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't have an answer for that. There's one more thing, Diane said, and something in her voice made the whole room go still again. She opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the table. Angelus, this is a shared calendar. Angelus, titled Evelyn Transition Plan, shared between the two of you and Warren Whitfield. I watched Claire's face drain of every last trace of color. There's an event scheduled 3 weeks from now, Angelus, Diane continued. Angelus, her voice flat. Angelus, professional. Angelus, devastating. Angelus, titled Guardianship Consultation. The silence that followed was different from every silence before it. Angelus, this one had teeth. You were going to have me declared incompetent, I said, Angelus, and my voice, Angelus, for the first time all afternoon, Angelus, shook not with fear, Angelus, but with a fury so complete it felt almost like calm. You were going to take away my right to speak for myself. Angelus, to make it so that whatever I said, Angelus, whatever I objected to, Angelus, whatever truth I tried to tell anyone, Angelus, it wouldn't matter, Angelus, because I'd already be legally silenced. Mom, it wasn't like that, Michael said desperately. It was just a consultation. We hadn't decided anything. We just wanted to explore. Angelus, explore taking away my voice, I said. Explores making sure that no matter what I said, no one would ever have to listen to me again. We were scared, Claire said, her voice rising now, cracking under its own weight. We were scared you'd figure it out before we could fix things, Angelus, and once you knew, Angelus, we thought if there was ever a dispute, Angelus, it would be safer to have already. Angelus, she stopped herself, but it was too late. Angelus, she'd already said it. Angelus, safer to have already. Safer for them, meaning more dangerous for me, meaning the guardianship consultation hadn't been a hypothetical safety net at all. It had been insurance against exactly this moment against me, sitting across the table from them, with the truth already assembled and nowhere left for either of them to hide. Angelus, I sat back in my chair and let the silence stretch. Angelus, let it fill every corner of that fluorescent lit room. Angelus, because I needed a moment. Angelus, just one moment. Angelus, to feel the full weight of what I now understood completely. My son and his wife had not stumbled into this. Angelus, they had planned it, Angelus, layer by layer, Angelus, for years, Angelus, and the moment they sensed the ground shifting beneath their plan, Angelus, their instinct hadn't been honesty. It had been to move faster, to lock me out of my own life before I could stop them. I want to ask you something, I said finally, looking at Michael. And I want you to really think before you answer, because I think this is the only question that actually matters right now. He nodded, his eyes red, his hands still clenched on the table. Angelus, if I hadn't found those keys, I said, if I hadn't heard you through that window, none of this had ever come out. What happens to me in 6 months, a year? He didn't answer right away. I watched something move behind his eyes, Angelus, some private reckoning I couldn't see the shape of, Angelus, and when he finally spoke, Angelus, his voice was barely audible. Angelus, I don't know, he said. Angelus, I told myself it wouldn't go that far. I told myself we'd stop before it became what the documents make it look like. Angelus, but you didn't stop, I said. Angelus, you kept going. Angelus, every step of it. Angelus, the account. Angelus, the house valuation. Angelus, the calendar. None of that sounds like a man who intended to stop. Angelus, I know, he whispered. Angelus, I know how it looks. It doesn't just look that way, Michael, I said. Angelus, it is that way. Angelus, Claire had gone very quiet beside him. Angelus, staring down at her hands. Angelus, and I noticed, Angelus, in that silence, Angelus, that neither of them had reached for the other. Whatever partnership had built this plan together seemed, Angelus, in this room, Angelus, under this weight, Angelus, to be quietly coming apart at its own seams, Angelus, each of them left alone with what they'd done. Diane cleared her throat gently, the sound of someone bringing a meeting back to its purpose. Evelyn has instructed me to take several immediate steps, Angelus, she said. Angelus, her voice returning to its calm. Angelus, procedural register. Angelus, though the calm felt different now, sharper, final. Effective today, all financial powers of attorney previously granted are being formally revoked. A new restricted document will replace them, granting authority to no one outside of Evelyn's direct instruction. Her accounts have already been secured against further unauthorized activity. Her home has a protective lien preventing any transfer or valuation request without her explicit notarized consent. Angelus, Michael's face had gone slack. Angelus, the reality of it settling invisibly. Angelus, physically. Angelus, like a weight pressing him down into his chair. We're not filing criminal charges today, Angelus, Diane continued. Angelus, and I watched both of them look up sharply at that, Angelus, something like desperate hope flickering across their faces before she finished the sentence. That decision remains entirely Evelyn's to make, and it remains on the table, depending on how the coming weeks unfold. Angelus, Mom, Michael said. Angelus, his voice breaking completely now, please. Angelus, please don't, we'll fix this. Angelus, we'll pay it back. Angelus, whatever it takes. Angelus, just please don't. Angelus, don't what, Michael? Angelus, I asked, and I heard, Angelus, in my own voice. Angelus, something I had never heard there before, not coldness exactly, Angelus, but a kind of settled, Angelus, immovable clarity. Don't protect myself. Don't do the thing you were so certain I'd never do. Angelus, he didn't answer. There was nothing left in him to argue with. Angelus, I looked at Claire one last time. Angelus, at the woman who had called me Mom for 10 years. Angelus, who had held my hand at my husband's grave. Angelus, who had brought me lemon cookies and coffee, and asked about my knees with a warmth I had never once doubted until a Tuesday afternoon changed everything. I don't know if I'll ever understand how you did all of this while still calling me family, I said. Angelus, I don't know if you understand it yourself. Claire's eyes filled again, but this time she didn't try to speak. Maybe, for the first time since we'd sat down, there wasn't a rehearsed sentence ready to soften what she'd done. Angelus, I stood up. My legs felt steadier than they had any right to feel, given everything that had just been said in that room. Rachel stood with me, Angelus, her hand finding mine again, Angelus, and together we gathered the folder Diane had prepared, Angelus, the evidence of a truth that no longer belonged only to me. Angelus, this meeting is over, I said. Angelus, Diane will be in touch regarding next steps. I'd ask that neither of you contact me directly until I'm ready. Angelus, I'll reach out when I am. Angelus, Mom, Michael said. Angelus, standing too. Angelus, his voice pleading now. Angelus, all pretense gone. Angelus, please, I love you. Whatever else is true, that part was never a lie. I stopped at the door and turned back to look at him, really look at him, at the man who had once been the boy I was proudest of in the world, at the son I had trusted more completely than I had trusted almost anyone in my life. Angelus, I believe you love me, Michael, I said quietly. Angelus, I think that's the saddest part of all of this. Angelus, I think you love me and still did this anyway. And I don't know yet how to hold both of those things at the same time. Angelus, I need time to figure that out. Don't take that time away from me, too. I walked out of that conference room without looking back, Angelus, Rachel's hand steady in mine, Angelus, and it wasn't until we were in the car, Angelus, doors closed, Angelus, engine off, Angelus, that I finally let myself fall apart completely, not the quiet, Angelus, controlled tears I'd allowed myself on the kitchen floor weeks earlier, Angelus, but something bigger, Angelus. Something that had been building since the moment I heard Claire's voice through that garage window and had been held back, Angelus, brick by brick, Angelus, ever since. Angelus, Rachel didn't say anything. She just reached over and held me while I cried, the way I used to hold her after nightmares when she was small, and for a long time neither of us spoke at all. The days that followed the meeting felt strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. Angelus, I had expected relief. I had expected, somewhere underneath all the grief, a sense of victory, the satisfaction of truth finally winning out over deception. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to touch. Angelus, Diane called every few days with updates. Angelus, the financial protections were fully in place. Angelus, the house was secured. Meadowline Holdings was under formal review. And though I still hadn't decided whether to pursue criminal charges, Diane had begun quietly documenting everything in a way that would preserve my options either way. Michael didn't call Angelus at first, Angelus, respecting the space I'd asked for, Angelus, though I heard from Rachel that he'd reached out to her a handful of times, Angelus, mostly just asking how I was doing, Angelus, whether I was eating, Angelus, whether I seemed okay. Angelus, it was such a strange, Angelus, small mercy, Angelus, hearing that some part of him was still worried about me in the ordinary, Angelus, unglamorous way a son worries about his mother, Angelus, separate from everything else that had happened. Angelus, Claire didn't reach out at all. I don't know if that was respect for my request or something closer to shame, Angelus, and I found, Angelus, to my own surprise, Angelus, that I didn't particularly care which it was. Angelus, about 2 weeks after the meeting, Angelus, Rachel and I were sitting at my kitchen table, the same table, Angelus, always the same table, Angelus, the site of every important moment in this entire ordeal, sorting through the last of the paperwork Diane had sent over, Angelus, when my phone rang. Angelus, Michael's name lit up the screen. Angelus, I looked at it for a long moment before answering. Rachel watched me, her hand hovering near mine, ready to take it from me if I needed her to. Angelus, I answered. Angelus, Mom, Michael said, Angelus, and his voice sounded different than it had in that conference room, smaller somehow. Angelus, stripped of every last trace of performance. Angelus, I know you said not to call. Angelus, I'm sorry. I needed to say something, and I didn't want to say it over text. Angelus, go ahead, I said. Claire and I aren't together anymore, he said. Angelus, she moved out 3 days ago. Angelus, I sat with that for a moment, Angelus, feeling something complicated move through me, not satisfaction, Angelus, not quite sympathy either, Angelus, something in between that I couldn't fully name. Angelus, I'm sorry to hear that, I said, Angelus, and I found, Angelus, somewhat to my own surprise, Angelus, that I meant it, Angelus, at least partially. Whatever they had done, whatever they had planned, there was a child in the middle of it. My granddaughter, who was going to grow up now with a broken family on top of everything else. I don't blame her for leaving, Michael said quietly. Angelus, I think we both knew, Angelus, sitting in that room, Angelus, that whatever we built together, Angelus, we built it on something rotten. I don't think either of us really knew how to look at the other one afterward. How's Emma? I asked, thinking of my granddaughter. Angelus, confused, Michael admitted. Angelus, sad, we haven't told her much, just that Mommy and Daddy need some time apart. I don't know how to explain the rest of it to her. Angelus, I don't know if I'll ever have to. Angelus, I closed my eyes, Angelus, feeling the weight of everything settle over me again, not just what had been done to me, Angelus, but everything it had touched, Angelus, everyone it had touched, Angelus, spreading outward like water, finding every low place in the ground. Angelus, Michael, I said finally. Angelus, I need you to understand something. Angelus, and I need you to really hear it. Angelus, not just agree with it to make this conversation easier. Angelus, okay, he said quietly. What you did wasn't a mistake, I said. A mistake is signing something you didn't read carefully. Angelus, a mistake is a bad business decision. Did was a choice, Angelus, made over and over again, Angelus, for years, Angelus, each time you had an opportunity to stop and tell me the truth instead. Angelus, I need you to sit with that. Not to punish yourself forever, Angelus, but because I think if you don't really understand what you did, Angelus, you'll find some other version of this to do again someday, Angelus, to someone else who trusts you. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Angelus, when Michael finally spoke, his voice was thick. Angelus, I understand, he said. Angelus, I've had a lot of time to think about it. Angelus, more than I want to admit. Angelus, good, I said. That's a start. Is there? He paused, and I could hear him gathering courage for the question he actually wanted to ask. Is there any chance someday that you could forgive me? I'm not asking you to say yes right now. Angelus, I just need to know if it's possible. There's a door still open somewhere, even a small one. I thought about that question for a long time before I answered it, Angelus, longer than felt comfortable over the phone, Angelus, but Michael waited, Angelus, and I appreciated that he didn't try to fill the silence. Angelus, I don't know yet, I said finally honestly. Angelus, I love you, Michael. Angelus, that hasn't changed, Angelus, and I don't think it ever will, Angelus, because that's not really how love works, Angelus, not the kind a mother has for a child. But loving you and trusting you are two very different things now, Angelus, and I think it's going to take a long time, Angelus, maybe years, Angelus, to know if trust is something that can be rebuilt after what happened. I'm not going to promise you an answer I don't have. Angelus, that's fair, he said quietly. Angelus, that's more than fair. Angelus, I need distance, I said. Angelus, real distance. Angelus, not punishment. Angelus, just space to figure out who I am now. Angelus, separate from being your mother for a little while. Angelus, because I think somewhere in all of this, Angelus, I stopped being anything else. Angelus, I understand, he said. Angelus, take whatever time you need. I'll be here whenever you're ready. Angelus, however long that takes. Angelus, we hung up not long after that, Angelus, and I sat at my kitchen table with the phone still in my hand, Angelus, feeling something shift inside me, not resolution, not yet, Angelus, but the first honest conversation Michael and I had had in longer than I wanted to admit, Angelus, maybe the first honest conversation we'd had in years. Rachel reached over and squeezed my shoulder. You okay? She asked. Angelus, I don't know, I admitted. Angelus, I think I will be. Angelus, eventually. Angelus, just not today. Over the following weeks, life began to take on a strange new rhythm, one built around the practical business of rebuilding a life I'd nearly lost without ever seeing it coming. Diane and I finalized new legal protections documents I read 3 times over before signing anything, Angelus. Documents with language I understood completely, Angelus, because I made sure of it, Angelus, every single word, Angelus, every single clause, Angelus, no yellow tabs steering my eyes away from what mattered. Angelus, I changed the locks on my house, Angelus, not because I thought Michael or Claire would try anything so obvious, Angelus, but because it felt important, Angelus, symbolically, Angelus, to be the only one who controlled who could walk through my own front door. I opened new accounts at a different bank, Angelus, one none of my family had ever used, Angelus, with a private banker who called me personally to walk through every feature, Angelus, every protection, Angelus, patient with every question I asked, no matter how basic. Rachel stayed longer than she'd originally planned, Angelus, working remotely from my guest room for almost a month, Angelus, and in the evenings we started doing something we hadn't done together since she was a teenager, cooking dinner side by side, talking, Angelus, really talk, Angelus, about things that had nothing to do with Michael or Claire or Warren Whitfield or any of it. Angelus, about her job, about a man she'd started seeing but hadn't mentioned to me yet, nervous I'd think it was too soon after everything, about memories of her father that I hadn't heard her share in years. One evening, standing at the stove while Rachel chopped vegetables beside me, she said something that stayed with me long after that night. You know, Mom, Angelus, she said, Angelus, not looking up from the cutting board, Angelus, I used to think you were the most trusting person I'd ever met. Angelus, almost to a fault. I used to worry about you a little, honestly worry someone would take advantage of how much you believed in people. Angelus, someone said quietly. Someone tried, Rachel corrected, finally looking up at me. But watching you these last few weeks, watching you sit in that room and take apart everything they'd built, piece by piece, without ever raising your voice, I don't think I've ever been more proud of anyone in my life. And you didn't just protect yourself, Mom. You basically ran an investigation better than half the detectives I've seen on television. Angelus, I laughed, surprising myself with how easily it came. Angelus, I had a good lawyer, I said. Angelus, you had good instincts, Rachel said. Diane just helped you prove what you already knew in your gut, standing outside that garage window. You knew, Mom, Angelus, from the very first second. You just had the courage to actually follow it, instead of talking yourself out of it, the way most people would have. I thought about that for a long time after she said it, Angelus, standing at my stove with the smell of garlic and onions filling the kitchen, Angelus, my daughter beside me, present, Angelus, choosing to stay close instead of letting distance and old wounds keep us apart the way it had with Michael for so many years. Angelus, I thought about Eleanor Voss, Angelus, a woman I had never met, Angelus, whose daughter Patricia had tried to do exactly what I had done and been cut out of her family for it, Angelus, left with nothing but unanswered questions and a grief that never fully closed. I thought about how easily my own story could have ended the same way, Angelus, if I hadn't found those keys, Angelus, if I hadn't heard those voices, Angelus, if some part of me hadn't refused to let a lifetime of trusting blindly override the instinct screaming that something was wrong. I didn't know yet, Angelus, standing in my kitchen that evening, Angelus, exactly what my relationship with Michael would look like a year from then, Angelus, or 5 years from then. I didn't know if the door I'd left cracked open for him would ever widen back into something whole, Angelus, or if it would stay exactly as narrow as it was now forever, Angelus, a reminder of what trust costs once it's been broken this completely. But I knew, Angelus, with a certainty that had taken 61 years and one terrible discovery to earn, Angelus, that whatever happened next, Angelus, I would face it with my eyes open. No folder would ever again pass in front of me with yellow tabs steering my attention away from the truth. No voice, however warm, Angelus, however familiar, Angelus, however much it called me Mom, Angelus, would ever again convince me to stop listening to the quiet, Angelus, steady instinct inside myself that had been right from the very first moment, Angelus, standing frozen on a garden path, Angelus, holding a set of keys that, Angelus, without my ever intending it, Angelus, unlocked far more than a front door. Angelus, they had unlocked me. Angelus, spring came slowly that year, Angelus, the way it always does after a long winter, Angelus, and I found myself standing in my backyard one morning in April, Angelus, coffee in hand, Angelus, watching the first green shoots push up through the soil where I'd planted bulbs the previous fall. I hadn't been sure, when I put them in the ground back in October, whether I'd have the heart to care about a garden by the time spring arrived. Angelus, so much had happened in between, Angelus, but there they were, Angelus, pushing upward anyway, Angelus, indifferent to everything I'd been through, Angelus, and something about their stubbornness made me smile for the first time in what felt like months. Angelus, 6 months had passed since that meeting in Diane's conference room. 6 months since I'd watched my son's face crumble across a table, Angelus, since I'd heard Claire admit, Angelus, in her own words, Angelus, that she'd known exactly what she was doing. Angelus, 6 months of rebuilding slowly, Angelus, carefully, Angelus, the way you rebuild anything that's been badly broken, not all at once, Angelus, but board by board, Angelus, checking each one before you trust your weight to it. The legal side of things had mostly settled. Angelus, Diane and I had decided, Angelus, together, Angelus, not to pursue criminal charges against Michael, Angelus, though Warren Whitfield was a different matter entirely. Diane had passed everything we'd found to Patricia Eleanor Voss's daughter, and the two of them, along with the prosecutor Patricia had finally found willing to listen, were building a case against Warren that stretched far beyond just my family. Angelus, it turned out, once people started looking, that Eleanor Voss and I were not the only names on his list. There were others. Quiet, careful families who had trusted the wrong person and never fully understood what had happened until it was too late. Angelus, I testified once, Angelus, in a deposition, Angelus, sitting across from a lawyer I'd never met, Angelus, answering questions about dates and documents and a garage window conversation that had started all of it. I remember my hands were steady the entire time. Angelus, I remember thinking, Angelus, halfway through, Angelus, how strange it was that the woman answering those questions bore almost no resemblance to the one who had stood frozen on that garden path 6 months earlier, Angelus, keys in her trembling hand, Angelus, too afraid to knock on her own son's door. Angelus, I had changed. Angelus, I knew that. I just hadn't fully understood until I sat in that deposition how completely. Michael and I spoke on the phone every couple of weeks by then, careful, measured conversations that neither of us rushed. He'd moved into a smaller apartment after the divorce finalized. His business, Angelus, against my expectations, Angelus, had actually started to recover not because of anything shady, Angelus, he assured me, Angelus, but because he'd finally sat down with an honest accountant and restructured things the right way, Angelus, the slow way, Angelus, the way that doesn't feel good in the moment but holds up over time. I should have done that a year ago, he told me on one of those calls. Angelus, instead of looking for a shortcut. Angelus, yes, I said simply. You should have. Angelus, I wasn't cruel about it. Angelus, I never wanted to be cruel. But I also stopped softening the truth for him the way I used to, stopped rushing to reassure him the moment he showed the smallest sign of discomfort. That had been part of the problem all along. I realized I had spent so many years making things easy for my son that I'd never given him the chance to sit with the weight of his own choices. Maybe if I had years earlier, none of this would have happened at all. Angelus, I would never know for certain. But I wasn't going to make that particular mistake again. He asked to see me in person for the first time around the 5-month mark. Angelus, I agreed, but on my terms, a public place. Angelus, a coffee shop near my house. Angelus, not his home. Angelus, not mine. Rachel offered to come with me, and I almost said yes, but something in me needed to do this part alone. I remember sitting at a small table by the window, watching him walk in, looking older than he had 6 months before, thinner, more tired, the confident businessman posture replaced by something more careful, more human. He sat down across from me, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. You look good, Mom, he finally said. Angelus, I feel good, I told him, and I meant it. Better than I have in years, actually. He nodded slowly, turning his coffee cup in small circles on the table, not quite meeting my eyes. Angelus, I think about that day a lot, he said. Angelus, the keys. Think about what would have happened if you'd just knocked on the door like normal. Angelus, if you'd never heard any of it. Angelus, I think about that too, I admitted. Angelus, do you regret it? He asked. Angelus, finding out? I considered the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. Angelus, no, I said finally. Angelus, I regret what you did. Angelus, I regret what it cost us. But I don't regret knowing the truth, Michael. I spent 61 years believing that love meant never questioning the people closest to you. Angelus, I know better now. And honestly, I think I'm a stronger person for it, even though I never wanted to learn that lesson this way. Angelus, he was quiet for a while, staring down at the table. I don't know how to ask you to forgive me, he said eventually. Angelus, I don't know if I even deserve to ask. You don't have to ask for it right now, I said. Forgiveness isn't something I can hand you on a schedule, Michael. It's not a document I can sign the way you had me sign things before. Angelus, it's going to take time. Angelus, it might take years. But I want you to know something, because I think it matters, and I think you need to hear it clearly. Angelus, he looked up at me, waiting. Angelus, I haven't given up on you, I said. Angelus, I'm not the same woman who trusted blindly. Angelus, I never will be again. Angelus, but I still love you. And I still believe, Angelus, somewhere underneath everything that happened, Angelus, there's a version of you capable of being honest, Angelus, capable of coming to me with the truth instead of a shortcut around it. I hope someday I get to meet that version of you again. Angelus, consistently. Not just in a coffee shop trying to make amends after the fact. His eyes filled, and for once he didn't try to hide it or apologize for it. Spend as long as it takes, he said quietly. Angelus, however long that is. Angelus, good, I said. Because that's exactly what it's going to take. It was Rachel, Angelus, more than anyone, Angelus, who helped me understand something I hadn't fully grasped in the immediate aftermath of everything, that healing wasn't going to look like forgetting, Angelus, and it wasn't going to look like some neat, Angelus, tidy reconciliation either. Angelus, it was going to look like this. Angelus, slow, imperfect, full of careful conversations and long silences and small, hard-won steps forward that sometimes felt like they weren't steps at all. She'd moved closer to me by early summer, Angelus, close enough that we saw each other most weekends, Angelus, and I found myself, Angelus, for the first time in years, Angelus, genuinely closer to my daughter than I had ever been to my son, not because I loved her more, Angelus, but because she had never once asked me to trust her blindly. Angelus, she had always earned it quietly, Angelus, consistently, Angelus, in 1,000 small honest moments that I had somehow taken for granted until I nearly lost everything with the child who hadn't. Angelus, one Sunday afternoon in June, Angelus, she came over with her boyfriend, the man she'd finally worked up the courage to introduce me to, a quiet, Angelus, kind schoolteacher named David, who looked at my daughter the way I imagined my husband used to look at me, Angelus, decades ago, Angelus, before everything got complicated. Angelus, we sat in my backyard, Angelus, the same yard where I'd watched those first green shoots push through the soil months earlier, Angelus, now full and blooming, Angelus, and Rachel looked around at the flowers with something like wonder. Angelus, this looks incredible, Mom, she said. You really brought this whole garden back. Angelus, it brought itself back, I told her. Angelus, I just stopped getting in its way. She laughed, but I meant it more than she probably realized. I had spent so many months learning to get out of my own way, to stop assuming the worst version of a hard truth, but also to stop assuming the best version of a comfortable lie. Somewhere in between those two extremes, I had finally found something like balance. My granddaughter Emma came to visit later that same month. During one of the custody weekends, Michael had arranged with Claire after the divorce settled. Angelus, she was 8 now, Angelus, missing one of her front teeth just like her father had been at that age in the photograph on my mantel, Angelus, and she ran straight into my arms the moment she got out of the car, Angelus, unburdened by any of the complicated adult history swirling around her. Grandma Evie, she said, Daddy said we're going to plant flowers today. We sure are, I told her, taking her small hand in mine and walking her toward the garden. We spent that whole afternoon in the dirt together, Angelus, her chattering about school, Angelus, about a friend who'd moved away, Angelus, about a book she was reading, Angelus, none of it touched by anything that had happened between the adults in her life. I watched her plant a small marigold with careful, Angelus, clumsy hands, Angelus, patting the soil around it exactly the way I showed her, Angelus, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't fully felt since before I found those keys on my counter. Whatever else had been broken in this family, Angelus, this small, Angelus, ordinary, Angelus, dirt under the fingernails afternoon with my granddaughter remained whole, Angelus, and I understood, Angelus, watching her work, Angelus, that this was exactly what I had been protecting when I refused to sign whatever they put in front of me, Angelus, when I hired Diane, Angelus, when I sat across that conference table and told the truth out loud instead of swallowing it the way I'd swallowed so many quiet doubts before. I hadn't just been protecting my money or my house or even my dignity, Angelus, I had been protecting this. Angelus, the right to be present, Angelus, clear-eyed and unmanipulated, Angelus, for exactly this kind of afternoon, Angelus, for as many years as I had left to have them. Diane called me in late July with news I hadn't expected. Warren Whitfield had accepted a plea deal. It wasn't the full public trial Patricia had hoped for, the kind that might have exposed every family he'd targeted over the years, but it was enough. Angelus, restitution. Angelus, a conviction on record. An end, finally, to whatever he'd been quietly doing to families like mine, for who knew how many years before Eleanor Voss's name ever crossed my path. Angelus, I called Patricia myself that week, Angelus, the first time we'd spoken directly instead of through Diane, Angelus, and we ended up on the phone for almost 2 hours, Angelus, 2 women who had never met in person, Angelus, bonded by an experience neither of us would have wished on anyone. Angelus, she told me about her mother, Angelus, about the years of estrangement from her brother that the plea deal wouldn't undo, Angelus, about the particular grief of losing someone to manipulation while they were still, Angelus, technically, Angelus, alive to call on the phone. I'm glad you got your son back, she told me near the end of the call, her voice thick. Angelus, even if it's not all the way back yet. Angelus, I never got that chance with my brother. Angelus, he still won't speak to me. He still thinks I destroyed our family by asking questions. You didn't destroy anything, I told her. Angelus, you tried to save it. There's a difference, even if he can't see it yet. Angelus, I know that, she said. Angelus, some days I even believe it. I thought about that conversation for a long time after we hung up, sitting alone in my kitchen as the evening light faded outside the window. Thought about how easily my story could have ended the way hers had, a fractured family, a silence that never lifted, a truth that came at the cost of everything instead of in service of saving some of it. I don't know exactly why Michael found his way back toward honesty and Patricia's brother didn't. I don't think there's a clean answer to that question, some formula I could hand to another grieving mother or sister to guarantee the same outcome. Some people, faced with the truth about what they've done, choose to keep running from it. Others eventually choose to turn around and face it. Angelus, I got lucky, Angelus, in a sense, Angelus, that my son chose the second path, Angelus, even if it took him far longer than it should have, Angelus, even if trust between us was Angelus, all these months later, Angelus, something we were building one careful conversation at a time rather than something I could hand back to him whole. By late summer, I had settled into something that finally felt like peace, though it was a different kind of peace than the one I'd had before all of this started. Angelus, that earlier peace, Angelus, I understood now, Angelus, had been built on something fragile and unexamined trust that I had mistaken for solid ground, Angelus, when really it had been closer to sand, Angelus, shifting quietly beneath me the whole time without my noticing. Angelus, this new peace was different. Angelus, harder won. Built on documents I read, Angelus, accounts I monitored myself, Angelus, a lockbox whose key never left my neck, Angelus, and a small, Angelus, steady voice inside me that I had learned finally, Angelus, after 61 years, Angelus, to actually listen to the moment it spoke up. Still saw Michael regularly by then, not as often as I once had, Angelus, and never quite the same way, Angelus, but regularly enough that I could see slowly, Angelus, the shape of a different relationship forming between us. He'd started coming to dinner every few weeks, always calling ahead now, always respecting whatever boundary I set without pushing against it the way he might have once. Talked more openly about the business, about his mistakes, about therapy he'd started attending, to understand why he'd let things get as far as they had. Angelus, I didn't know if all of it would last. I didn't know if trust, once broken this completely, could ever be rebuilt to its original shape. Angelus, but I watched him try, Angelus, consistently, Angelus, honestly, Angelus, week after week, Angelus, and that effort itself had started to mean something to me, Angelus, even if I wasn't ready to call it forgiveness just yet. Angelus, Claire I never spoke to again. Angelus, I heard through Rachel, Angelus, that she'd moved to another state, Angelus, started over somewhere new, Angelus, and I found that I genuinely wished her well, Angelus, in the distant, Angelus, complicated way you wish well for someone who hurt you badly but whom you also understand, Angelus, on some level, Angelus, was fighting her own private battle you'd never fully see the shape of. I didn't need to understand her completely to let her go. Angelus, I just needed to let her go. Angelus, one evening in early September, Angelus, I sat on my back porch with a cup of tea, Angelus, watching the light shift gold and then gray across my garden, Angelus, the same garden that had carried me through every season of this entire ordeal. I thought about the woman I had been the day I found those keys on my kitchen counter, trusting without question, comfortable in a peace that had never really been peace at all, just the absence of anything that had yet forced her to look closely. Thought about the woman I had become since. Angelus, careful, clear-eyed, willing to ask hard questions even when the answers terrified her, willing to sit across a table from her own son and tell him the truth, even knowing it might cost her the relationship entirely. I thought about Eleanor Voss, a woman I never met but whose story ran alongside mine like a shadow the whole way through, a reminder of exactly what silence and blind trust can cost a person in the end. I thought about Patricia, still fighting for a brother who might never come back to her. And I thought about how close I had come to that same ending. If I had simply knocked on that door instead of standing frozen outside the garage window, if I had let one uncomfortable feeling pass without ever following it to the truth underneath. Angelus, I didn't knock that day. And because I didn't, I found everything I needed to save myself. Angelus, that I have come to understand, Angelus, is the real lesson buried underneath everything that happened to me, not that families can betray you, Angelus, though they can, Angelus, and not that love alone is never quite enough protection, Angelus, though it isn't. The real lesson is smaller than that and somehow larger too. Angelus, it is simply this, Angelus, your own instincts, Angelus, the quiet, Angelus, uncomfortable feeling that tells you something is wrong, even when everyone around you insists everything is fine. Angelus, deserve to be trusted. Angelus, not blindly. Angelus, not recklessly. But honestly, the way you would trust the counsel of your oldest, most loyal friend. I lost a version of my son the day I heard those voices through that garage window, Angelus, but I found myself instead, Angelus, standing right there on that same garden path, Angelus, keys in my trembling hand, Angelus, more completely than I had in decades of quietly, Angelus, comfortably, Angelus, trusting everyone around me without ever once questioning myself. Angelus, I am 62 years old now. Angelus, I still live in the home I built. I still drink my coffee at the same kitchen table where all of this truth first came apart and then slowly, Angelus, painfully, Angelus, began coming back together. Still walk through my garden every morning, watching things grow that I planted with my own careful hands. And I still watch my granddaughter grow, Angelus, marigold by marigold, Angelus, season by season, Angelus, in a family that is different now, Angelus, smaller in some ways, Angelus, but honest in a way it had never fully been before. Trust, I have learned, is precious. It should never be given away carelessly, and it should never be assumed simply because someone shares your blood or calls you mom. But your own voice, the one quiet enough to miss if you're not listening, and strong enough to save your entire life if you finally do, that voice is priceless. And the day you stop listening to it is the day you hand your life over to someone else's decisions, whether you realize it or not. Angelus, I will never make that mistake again. Angelus, not for anyone. Not even for the people I love the most in this world. And that more than any document Diane ever helped me sign, Angelus, more than any lockbox, Angelus, more than any lesson I have carried out of this entire ordeal, that is the truest, Angelus, most complete protection I have ever given myself.